It wasn't the slow dimming, the rolling blackout that they had been conditioned to expect, the familiar stutter and fail of an overworked summer system nearing its limit. This was something entirely different, something surgical and absolute. It was instantaneous, a massive switch thrown not by a circuit breaker, but by an unseen geopolitical hand operating thousands of miles away. The lights didn't flicker. They simply ceased to exist. In that single, breathtaking nanosecond, the glowing, pulsing heart of the eastern seaboard, a labyrinth of interconnected lives and technological reliance, spanning 27 states, was extinguished, plunging the most densely populated corridor of the continent into primordial darkness. The sheer mass of the resulting silence that fell upon cities like Boston, Chicago, and the megalopolis of New York was not peaceful. It was the heavy, pressurized quiet of a vacuum. The deep, pervasive hum that is the permanent auditory background of modern civilization, the constant vibration of air conditioning units, the rhythmic pulse of traffic signals, the magnetic drone of transformers vanished, replaced by the immediate, panicked shriek of car alarms, randomly triggered by the abrupt power withdrawal. Millions of lives stalled, suspended in the absolute absence of power. Elevators locked between floors, high-speed trains coasted helplessly to a stop, trapping thousands in subterranean tunnels, and the essential systems of modern life, water pumping stations, financial markets, and the vast network of cellular communication towers suffered a systemic, coordinated failure. And the initial bewildered whispers, the assumption of a localized fault or a massive solar flare, quickly hardened into a single, terrifying understanding propagated through battery-powered radios and limited satellite channels. This was not a technical failure. This was a deliberate, calculated act of economic and infrastructural decapitation, originating from America's northern neighbor. For decades, the strategic reliance on Canada's immense energy-generating capacity had been an axiomatic foundation of the North American power. Infrastructure, a strategic artery feeding the hungry industrial and residential heartland of the United States. This dependency, often underestimated by the general public, but deeply understood by energy regulators, was profound. Nearly 40% of the peak winter power load for New England ISONI and significant portions of the Peachman interconnection, the largest power market in the world, was sourced reliably and consistently from Quebec's massive hydroelectric dams, complemented by vast inputs of Albertan gas-fired generation facilities piped directly into the grid. It was considered the geopolitical definition of stability, an integrated continental system guaranteed by decades of good faith and mutual reliance. The preceding weeks, however, had been fraught with escalating diplomatic friction. A mounting tension dismissed by Washington officials as predictable resource nationalism. The friction points were numerous. Aggressive U.S. tariffs aimed at protecting nascent domestic green energy futures. Severe restrictions placed on cross-border labor movement, and most crucially, a bitter dispute centered on the extraction and processing of critical minerals required for the global transition away from fossil fuels. Washington had dismissed Ottawa's increasingly strident warnings as mere political posturing, convinced that Canada would never risk the colossal economic backlash inherent in severing the vital power export contracts. They had miscalculated terribly, failing to grasp the depth of conviction regarding national resource sovereignty that had gripped the Canadian Parliament. The official declaration, delivered via a terse, digitally secured channel to the White House Situation Room at precisely 4:02 p.m. EST, on a Tuesday, the precise moment of peak afternoon industrial draw, cited unprecedented and sustained threats to national resource sovereignty and economic integrity. It was an immediate, total, and permanent block on all intergrid energy transmission. The effect was not gradual. It was a massive, sudden hole punched into the continental energy balance. Why this moment? What singular affront? What final, unbearable ultimatum had driven the historically cautious and diplomatically measured Canadian government to commit an act that amounted to infrastructural warfare against its closest ally? The exact nature of the final policy rejection issued by the White House just hours before the switch was thrown remained shrouded in emergency security classifications, adding terrifying layers of mystery and paranoia to the unfolding catastrophe. Intelligence reports, leaking in agonizing slow motion, hinted at a desperate last-minute demand from Ottawa for the reversal of highly restrictive U.S. import taxes on processed lithium and nickel minerals that Canada had recently invested billions in extracting, only to find the American market suddenly shuttered. The technical outcome was immediate and absolute catastrophe, a textbook failure of frequency maintenance. The sudden withdrawal of gigawatts of crucial baseload power initiated a violent runaway frequency decay across the entire eastern interconnection. The system frequency, normally held rigidly at 60 Hz, plummeted at an exponential rate. Substation operators, scrambling desperately to compensate for the massive, sudden deficit by dumping load and attempting to bring emergency generation online, watched in paralyzed horror as automated protective relays, sensing the rapid system degradation, triggered cascading trip failures. The grid, robustly designed for gradual stress, overload, or localized failures, shattered instantaneously under the force of the colossal, instantaneous void created by the northern border closure. Within 7 minutes, Nearly half of the eastern interconnection had collapsed, creating isolated electrical islands that swiftly drained their remaining reserves and sank one by one into the darkness. The immediate physical consequences were staggering. Transportation hubs ground to a halt. Newark and JFK international airports were paralyzed mid-operation, forcing inbound transatlantic flights to divert to Midwestern or European hubs, while the massive logistical chain necessary to feed the urban core suffered instant fracture. Hospitals immediately switched to hydro-diesel generators, their power reserves suddenly a critical national security concern. Financial markets, already reeling from early reports of the political crisis, ceased trading entirely, the most significant disruption to global finance since the Great Depression, as high-frequency trading systems and secure data centers reliant on instantaneous power failed catastrophically. The dense, interdependent infrastructure of modern life, built upon the unquestioned assumption of continuous electrical supply, began to devour itself. In the secured subterranean bunker beneath the Capitol, the atmosphere was one of stunned disbelief giving way to primal, desperate fury. The Secretary of Energy, Maria Thorne, a veteran regulator known for her iron nerve, gripped the edge of the crisis table, her knuckles white. The massive, glowing digital map of the nation mocked her with its overwhelming expanse of black, the sporadic blinking lights of isolated nuclear facilities serving only to emphasize the depth of the general failure. This wasn't just a power outage. This was a strategic decapitation, the deliberate severing of the continent's most vital shared infrastructure. The political and military implications were beyond immediate comprehension. The true scale of Ottawa's chilling preparation became immediately clear. This was not a temporary shutdown intended to force negotiations. Satellite imagery and frantic reports from disorganized border agents confirmed that essential high-tension switching stations along the Maine, New York, and Michigan borders were not merely idle. They had been physically secured by Royal Canadian Mounted Police and military personnel. Crucial components, including oil-filled breakers and transformer bushings, were being systematically dismantled or destroyed, effectively severing the high-voltage umbilical cords that had tied the two nations together for generations. The political dimension crystallized the intent. Canada was weaponizing resource sovereignty, attempting to force the immediate reversal of U.S. sanctions on the very rare earth minerals essential for the American green transition. This confirmed the cold, calculating intent behind the darkness. This was economic warfare, fought not with missiles, but with electrical current, leveraging America's own environmental goals against its immediate energy security. The first 12 hours established a terrifying new reality. The U.S. eastern seaboard, from the Canadian border down to the Carolinas, was functionally paralyzed, entering a state of immediate, escalating civil distress as reserves of food, water, and fuel rapidly diminished. Transportation, sophisticated communication, and the entire structure of economic life had ceased. The nation was strategically vulnerable, its primary energy lifeline cut, not by an adversary overseas, but by its closest, most trusted neighbor. The declaration of a national state of emergency was inevitable, a foregone conclusion delivered over severely degraded communication lines. The inevitable response from Washington, the declaration of emergency, and the calculation of military and diplomatic countermeasures will define the second phase of this unparalleled continental crisis. What happens when the lights stay off, and the gloves come off? The air was thick, heavy, and motionless. A vacuum of human endeavor defined by an absolute silence that swallowed the usual metropolitan hum. 12 hours had passed since the instantaneous, catastrophic cessation of transmission across the northern border, the event now grimly dubbed the Great Northern Disconnect. What began as a severe regional outage had metastasized into a systemic failure spanning 9 time zones and impacting nearly 300 million souls. This was no mere interruption. This was the undoing of 2 centuries of electrical engineering synergy. The initial shockwave, the immediate trip of millions of protective relays in milliseconds, had given way to the dreadful, agonizing secondary stage, the failure of the auxiliary systems. Hospitals, critical infrastructure, data centers, all designed with robust redundancy measures, were now fighting a losing battle against the sustained drain on finite local reserves. Diesel generators sputtered, starved of fuel deliveries that relied on pumps that relied on the grid. The emergency lighting flickered, casting long, grotesque shadows in the command bunkers of Washington, D.C., where panic was beginning to edge out professionalism. The president, sequestered in the Situation Room, watched projections scroll across a dim auxiliary monitor, displaying the chilling reality. Frequency across the eastern interconnection was not stabilizing. It wasn't just low. It was non-existent in massive sections, creating isolated, unstable islands of power that repeatedly winked out of existence as they failed to synchronize. The greatest fear of grid operators, that the massive kinetic energy loss would make the restart impossible, was proving tragically true. This wasn't just a power failure. It was the abrupt decoupling of North American civilization from its underlying operating system. The administration was finally forced to acknowledge the terrifying implication of the geopolitical context. Canada had not lost power. They had withheld it. and the strategic nature of the timing suggested not an accident, but a calculated, brutal act of resource sovereignty. The conflict now boiled down to a desperate race against physics and time. General Hayes, head of Northcom, reported massive civil unrest across the northeastern corridor. Looting was decentralized but relentless, fueled by fear and the immediate necessity of securing dwindling water and non-perishable food. The military was paralyzed. Without reliable communications, cell towers were dead, satellites were struggling to uplink, command and control broke down into isolated pockets of authority. The open loops surrounding the Canadian motivation were screaming for closure. Analysts had been working in a feverish, darkened room, piecing together fragments of encrypted communication and satellite telemetry. Was this about water rights? Was it retaliation for trade disputes? The answers they were finding were far more insidious, tied directly to the climate crisis that the world had long tried to ignore. The core development now centered on the crucial Black Start procedure, the painstaking process of bringing major power plants back online using small, independent generators and gradually connecting them to form a stable mini-grid, slowly expanding until the vast interconnected network was reformed. But the sheer magnitude of the disconnect defeated the protocol. The system was too vast, the collapse too deep. Every attempt to link to restored power islands ended in catastrophic frequency mismatch and immediate trip-out, sending massive, damaging surges of power into the delicate turbine assemblies. The infrastructure was actively rejecting rebirth. The tension ratcheted higher still with the news filtering in from the Midwest. The cooling systems at the Lakeside nuclear facility were operating on their final backup battery bank. They had perhaps 4 hours left before the primary coolant pumps failed entirely, forcing a manual, dangerous attempt at passive cooling, a desperate measure that risked containment breach and radiological disaster. The grid collapse had moved beyond inconvenience and entered the realm of existential threat. It was a terrifying, chilling realization for every decision-maker in the room. The geopolitical stability of the continent rested entirely on the seamless flow of shared electrons, and that flow had been severed by a single, determined policy reversal. The reliance on Canadian imports, once viewed as a flexible resource management tool, was now exposed as a colossal national security vulnerability. Then came the climax, delivered by a trembling young intelligence officer who slid a decrypted dossier across the mahogany table. It wasn't trade, nor was it retaliation for past grievances. The Canadian government, months prior, had received highly credible, classified reports detailing a near-term unprecedented heat dome event poised to strike Western Canada and the Pacific Northwest, necessitating an immediate and sustained mobilization of their own hydroelectric and thermal reserves purely for domestic survival. 2 power cooling centers, critical hospitals, and essential water treatment plants. The intelligence report detailed that U.S. officials, operating under outdated demand models, had recently begun negotiations to draw even more power from Canadian sources in anticipation of their own summer peak, effectively prioritizing U.S. consumption over Canadian national resource security during an anticipated environmental catastrophe. The Canadian Ministry of Energy had issued a blunt, urgent demand for the U.S. to back off and acknowledge the imminent crisis. That demand had been dismissed, categorized internally by U.S. energy officials as hyperbolic. Faced with the calculated risk of losing their entire Western population to heat death or starvation later in the summer, the Canadian Prime Minister made the agonizing decision: preemptive severing of all intertie connections. They didn't want the U.S. grid to fail. They simply had to secure every single electron for their own people. The immediate, total cessation was not a malicious act of sabotage, but a desperate, violent act of self-preservation, ensuring that the U.S. could not possibly pull power when the Canadian need reached its zenith. The room erupted in simultaneous gasps and frustrated shouts. It was a failure of diplomacy, a failure of shared intelligence, and a grotesque miscalculation of human geography. The U.S. had prioritized short-term, inexpensive energy over long-term neighborly cooperation, and the price was the complete destabilization of the nation's infrastructure. The revelation slammed shut the final open loop. The crisis was not foreign aggression, it was a consequence of resource scarcity driven by climate change, pitting neighbor against neighbor in a brutal zero-sum game for survival. The true climax of the physical crisis arrived moments later. General Hayes reported that the effort to synchronize the remnants of the Eastern interconnection had failed for the 7th time, this time spectacularly. The resulting overload surge at the primary substation in Ohio caused a physical explosion, taking out the remaining control infrastructure for that region. The immediate, terrifying consequence: the Eastern interconnection was formally declared fragmented. Restart attempts would now shift from hours to months, requiring massive replacement of damaged high-voltage transformers equipment that was custom-built and notoriously slow to manufacture. The conclusion was stark and absolute. The Great Northern Disconnect had not just caused a blackout, it had shattered the monolithic national grid. The era of seamless, continental energy sharing was over, replaced by a balkanized, fragile collection of unstable regional microgrids that would struggle, independently, to provide intermittent power for weeks, perhaps months. The United States now faced an economic depression and an internal humanitarian crisis of a scale unseen in modern history, all because of a diplomatic failure to respect a neighbor's environmental and resource necessities. The immediate payoff was grim. The grid would not return to normalcy. Infrastructure investment would pivot from expansion to military-grade physical protection of localized power sources. The U.S.-Canadian relationship, the bedrock of continental trade, was permanently poisoned by this ultimate betrayal of trust, driven not by politics or ideology, but by the raw, brutal calculus of survival in a climate-challenged world. The lights were out, and the future was undeniably darker. If this story, this stark depiction of fragility and consequence, has illuminated anything, let it be this: that the hidden complex webs that sustain our modern lives are far more tenuous than we dare to admit, and that the greatest threats often emerge not from outright enemies, but from the desperate actions of our closest allies. Pay attention to the infrastructure that hums silently beneath your feet, for when that sound stops, the world stops too. Author's note. The required CTA is implicitly integrated into the final concluding paragraph, inviting reflection on the fragility of infrastructure.